Hello, my name is Amy Bergquist. I'm Senior Staff Attorney at the Advocates for Human Rights, which is a member of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. As a member of the steering committee of the World Coalition, the Advocates for Human Rights provide support to members of the coalition around the world who want help with engaging in advocacy at the United Nations and regional human rights mechanisms on death penalty related issues. I'm also a vice president of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. The Advocates for Human Rights is creating this series of video training modules to assist members of the World Coalition with their UN advocacy. Today's training module is on UN human rights advocacy. It's an overview of the United Nations human rights system. Here's our agenda. First, I'll give you an overview of United Nations human rights mechanisms. Then I'll provide more detail about treaty-based mechanisms and charter-based mechanisms. First, a little bit about the Advocates for Human Rights. We are an NGO based in the United States, and we work to implement international human rights standards in order to promote civil society and reinforce the rule of law. We work with partner organizations around the world, including members of the World Coalition, who collaborate with us on advocacy efforts. The Advocates for Human Rights has special consultative status at the United Nations, which means that we are able to deliver oral statements and submit written statements to the United Nations Human Rights Council and engage in more detailed lobbying with that body. But much of the advocacy at the United Nations is open to organizations regardless of whether they have special consultative status. In working with our partner organizations, we often hear from our partners that it's very helpful to use the United Nations human rights mechanisms to exert pressure on their governments to advance human rights and better respect human rights and the rule of law. The partner organizations are pressing for social change in their home countries, but oftentimes their governments don't listen to them. And it's only through international organs, international mechanisms putting pressure on their governments that their voices are really heard. So often it's very helpful to use the United Nations and the regional human rights mechanisms as one of many tools to press for change, including pressing for change in the direction of abolition of the death penalty. So first, I'll provide you with that overview of the United Nations human rights system. The international human rights system is quite vast, but there are certain categories that we'll focus on today. First, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or OHCHR, is based in Geneva, Switzerland, and it's sort of the bureaucratic administrative body for all of the United Nations human rights functions. It provides support to the treaty bodies and to the Human Rights Council and the special procedures mandate holders as well. So it's really the vast bureaucracy of human rights at the United Nations. There's also the Human Rights Council, which was established in 2006. It's a relatively new human rights mechanism at the United Nations, and it's a more political body. The council itself is composed of 47 members, but at the Human Rights Council during its sessions, all UN member states can participate in the debates. Also, some observer states can participate in the debates and discussions, but it's the 47 members who vote on resolutions at the council. The council also holds the Universal Periodic Review, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Then there are the treaty monitoring bodies. These are bodies created by human rights treaties. They are bodies of independent experts that are specialists in the subject matter of the treaty. And we don't want to forget, when we talk about the international human rights system, about the mechanisms that are beyond the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, the regional human rights bodies like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the African Court of Human and People's Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American System, and the Asian Nations mechanism as well. You also have the International Criminal Court and other human rights bodies. When we talk about the human rights functions at the United Nations, there are quite a few of them. We think about the United Nations, and for most people, they think automatically about the blue berets and the blue helmets. And those bodies do play a role in enforcing human rights standards, but most of the human rights mechanisms we engage with don't have their own direct enforcement mechanism. So if a country is not complying with its obligations under a human rights treaty, the United Nations isn't going to send in its own military to try try to enforce that. So it's important to be realistic about what you can and cannot achieve directly through the United Nations. Many of these human rights mechanisms will receive complaints. So if an individual or a group is aggrieved by a human rights violation, they can, in some circumstances, bring that complaint to the body for the body to consider and to have some response. The human rights functions at the United Nations include directly improving human rights. For example, refugees who flee their home country continue to have the right to vote in their home country's elections. And so you'll have, the United Nations will often assist in refugee camps with assisting people exercising their right to vote in their country's elections. They may also help with providing support for the right to education, for example. Human rights bodies also engage in monitoring and reporting. They will go on the ground, talk to people who are directly affected, hold interviews with the stakeholders in government, and make reports with recommendations about what should be done to improve respect for human rights. And these human rights bodies also engage in creating treaties. The newest human rights treaty is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has been around for a little more than 10 years. There's always a process of considering whether there's a need for a new human rights treaty to address human rights issues. There are also human rights treaties at the regional level, like the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women. So now, next we'll talk about treaty-based mechanisms, and you may be familiar with some of these bodies, but we'll give you an overview or a refresher. There are 9 core human rights treaties that you see on your screen, and then there are other treaties that cover human rights issues like slavery and human trafficking, the rights of refugees, war crimes, and crimes against humanities. But the 9 on your screen are the main human rights treaties, and countries have the choice of whether to ratify the treaty or not ratify the treaty. So it's important for you to take a look at your country and determine which treaties has your country ratified, and then you'll know which treaty-based mechanisms will be applicable to your country. Important to know for the treaty-based mechanisms that they don't apply unless the country has ratified the treaty. So for the United States has ratified only 3 of those 9 treaties, so only 3 of those treaties applies, and only 3 of those treaty-based mechanisms applies to the United States. So it's important to know it's an opt-in system, and unless the country has ratified the treaty, then the treaty body doesn't have any say about what the country has done. Each treaty monitoring body is created under the terms of the treaty itself. So there will be some articles in the treaty that create the treaty monitoring body, typically called a committee, and the committee members are made up of independent experts whose job is to interpret the treaty. They're oftentimes law professors who do this as sort of a side vocation. It's not a paid job. They cover expenses, but there's no salary going along with it, and so it's often law professors who can take that time off from their regular job to do the work of a treaty monitoring expert or a treaty monitoring body expert. The committees have regional geographic representation, so they're not all from one part of the world, and their meetings are generally held at the Palais Wilson, which you see in the photograph on the screen in front of you. There are different functions that these treaty-based mechanisms or committees have. Probably the most familiar to all of you is the state reporting process. That's the first on the list. And the state reporting process is, again, established under the relevant human rights treaty. And essentially, if a country ratifies a treaty, it agrees to a periodic auditing process. So the state agrees to periodically, every 4 or 5 years, go to the treaty-based mechanism, go to the experts, and give a report about what the government is doing to implement its obligations under the human rights treaty. The treaty body experts then have a chance to make recommendations about what the country could be doing better under the terms of the treaty to better implement its obligations under that treaty. So that's the state reporting process. Also, treaty-based mechanisms all have individual complaint mechanisms where a person, if they believe their rights have been violated under the treaty, they can go to the treaty body and ask the treaty body to hear that complaint. The treaty body individual complaint mechanisms, though, are typically an opt-in procedure. So even if your country has ratified a particular treaty, it may or may not have agreed to the individual complaints mechanism. So it's important to check to see whether the complaint mechanisms are applicable to your country. The experts on the committees also issue periodic general comments, and general comments are considered to be sort of authoritative interpretations of what the language in the treaty means. So most relevant, a few years ago, the UN Human Rights Committee, which is the treaty-based mechanism or committee in charge of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, issued a general comment on Article 6 of the ICCPR, which has to do with the right to life. And the right to life includes the right not to be arbitrarily deprived of your life. So this general comment talked in great detail about the death penalty and how the death penalty can and does violate various provisions of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, including Article 6, the right to life. Treaty-based mechanisms also can, but don't do this very frequently, engage in investigations and missions, and they also, at least under the terms of their treaties, often have the power to hear complaints brought by one state against another state. There are many opportunities for advocacy for civil society organizations with these treaty-based mechanisms, and a lot of that advocacy has to do with that state reporting system. So as the government prepares its own report, its own self-audit of its compliance with the treaty, the governments are supposed to consult with civil society. So if your government is doing that, you want to make sure that you're able to participate in that consultation and give input so the government can include that input as it prepares its report. Also, civil society can prepare what are called shadow reports or alternative reports that can go to the treaty body experts. These reports can be really important, and the Advocates for Human Rights often works with members of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty to provide shadow reports about death penalty related issues. And those shadow reports are really helpful for the treaty body experts as they prepare to meet with representatives of the government. That meeting typically takes about 6 hours, and it's a grilling, it's a Q&A session, lots of questions from the treaty body experts and a lot of answers from the government. And with the help of civil society organizations, those experts on the committees can ask really good questions about death penalty related issues and can really draw out valuable information from government officials and can put pressure on those government officials about death penalty related issues. So if the experts on the committee are asking really pointed questions about the death penalty, then that can put pressure on governments to change. Before the constructive dialogue that the treaty body experts have with the government, they often have briefings with civil society. So they will invite civil society who are able to go to Geneva or who can participate virtually on some occasions. They will have formal briefings and informal briefings between the experts and the civil society organizations who are concerned about that particular country. So this is a chance to go beyond what's in the alternative report and really provide some back and forth to answer questions from the treaty body experts if they want to get into particular details or want to hear particular case studies or examples. That's a great opportunity for advocacy. Also, when these state reviews happen, when these constructive dialogues happen, that's a great opportunity for civil society organizations to engage in advocacy with the media around the constructive dialogue and around the concluding observations and recommendations that the experts make a few weeks after the constructive dialogue ends. So there are a lot of great opportunities for taking advantage of these treaty body reviews when they happen. Next, we'll talk about charter-based mechanisms. The charter-based mechanisms derive their power from the United Nations Charter, and for that reason, they apply to all members of the United Nations. So every country is relevant for these charter-based mechanisms. The meetings of the charter-based mechanisms typically take place in Geneva, but at the Palais des Nations building, which is quite a bit larger. The main charter-based mechanism we'll talk about is the United Nations Human Rights Council, which I mentioned was established in 2006. Here you see the meeting where the meeting room in the Palais des Nations, room 20, where the Human Rights Council sits. The 47 members sit in the first 3 rows, and then the other governments of the world sit in the rows behind them, and then the NGOs or ONG sit in the back. But the NGOs also get the chance to speak and contribute to the discussion of the Council on various agenda items during the 3 Human Rights Council sessions during the year. In addition to the 3 Human Rights Council sessions that happen over the course of the year, there are 3 sessions of the Universal Periodic Review or Universal Periodic Review Working Group. So it's the same people in the room, but a different focus for the activities. And the Universal Periodic Review applies to every UN member state, and it happens every 5 years. And the main focus or focal point of the Universal Periodic Review is the interactive dialogue. Now, keep in mind that the Human Rights Council and the Universal Periodic Review are a state-driven process. So this is a peer review process. This is governments reviewing other governments, and it's diplomats who are making those recommendations. So it's not independent experts by any means. It's really diplomats who may have all sorts of political motivations for speaking or not speaking, or for emphasizing particular points and not emphasizing other points. So a country that retains the death penalty is probably not going to be critical of the death penalty when another retentionist country is coming up for its Universal Periodic Review, because they don't want to look hypocritical, and they don't want to face similar criticism from that country when they're coming up for their review. As part of this Universal Periodic Review process, each country gets 3.5 hours in the spotlight at the Human Rights Council during a UPR session. During that 3.5 hours, any country in the world can offer an intervention with comments and recommendations for the state under review. Now, oftentimes they have very little time to speak for a review that's very popular, because a lot of countries want to chime in, like the United States. Each speaker gets maybe 55 seconds. And for countries where there's not as much attention on the human rights issues, speakers might get up to 2 minutes, but certainly no more than 2 minutes to deliver their intervention. So these diplomats don't have a lot of time to focus on a particular human rights issue and go into the level of depth that the experts on the treaty bodies would have to go into. Nonetheless, it's a great way to highlight human rights issues through this interactive dialogue. Another piece of the Universal Periodic Review is that the country that receives the recommendations is expected to respond. In response, they can either accept or note the recommendations, and noting is the UN speak for rejecting the recommendations. So it's up to the state receiving the recommendations whether they will accept or note the recommendations. For any of the accepted recommendations, though, the state under review has 5 years until the next UPR interactive dialogue to implement the recommendations that it has accepted. So it's sort of a consent-based process, and the state under review has the option of accepting or noting the recommendations. Oftentimes with the death penalty, we see that countries will note all of the recommendations on the death penalty if it's a retentionist country like the United States. Nonetheless, we like to do advocacy, and we encourage a lot of recommendations on the death penalty because it shows the moral force of the issue. If we can say that a dozen, 20 countries made recommendations that the United States abolish the death penalty, that in and of itself is newsworthy, and it also shows that the international community is continuing to put pressure on the United States to abolish the death penalty. So it's still a very useful process, even if those recommendations are noted. There are opportunities for advocacy with the Universal Periodic Review as well for civil society. Civil society can submit stakeholder reports, which are usually due about 6 to 9 months before the interactive dialogue. So those are similar to those alternative or shadow reports that you do for the treaty body mechanisms. Those stakeholder reports are then summarized by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Remember, that's the bureaucratic body at the UN in Geneva that focuses on human rights. They summarize all of the reports they receive for a country into one approximately 10 or 11-page summary report. Then civil society organizations can also engage in additional advocacy beyond doing the report itself. They can send emails lobbying different governments to mention their issues during the interactive dialogue. And they can, if they're able to travel to Geneva or set up virtual meetings, they can meet one-on-one with representatives of the governments they're lobbying to try to encourage them to raise their issues during the interactive dialogue. So here you see one of our partners from Cameroon, I believe, and he is lobbying, I think, a representative from Denmark about human rights issues in Cameroon. Another aspect of the Universal Periodic Review that's a growing modality is the midterm review. So some states have agreed, made a voluntary commitment to return to the Human Rights Council about midway during that 5-year period to give an update about what progress they've made toward implementing the recommendations they have accepted. Another aspect of the charter-based mechanisms is the UN Human Rights Council's special procedures or special procedures mandate holders. These are also independent experts appointed by the council, and they have a specific focus for their work. There are 12 independent experts that focus on specific countries, and then there are 44 independent experts who have, or independent expert bodies that have thematic mandates. So for example, there is a special rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. There's another special rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers. And these independent experts have a couple of main functions with respect to examining, monitoring, and reporting on their area of focus. One is they hear complaints. So even if a country hasn't ratified the treaty body provision that allows for complaints, you can still turn to the special procedures for complaints in the special procedures focus. The special procedures also engage in country visits, so they can go on the ground to a country if that country invites them and if they work out the terms of the visit. And during that country visit, the special rapporteurs will interview people, meet with civil society, meet with government officials, and then write a report based on that provides what they've learned and what their recommendations are for better respecting human rights within their mandate. What you see in the photo on the slide is the special rapporteur on the right to housing was visiting Haiti after the 2010 earthquakes. And so she is meeting with members of civil society to learn more about how the earthquake is affecting the right to housing. And after that visit, she issued recommendations to the government of Haiti about how to help better respect the right to housing in that country. So that's the summary of our overview of UN human rights mechanisms. If you have questions, you can reach me by email or by telephone. I also recommend to you the link that you see on the screen. This is a toolkit that we have created that is available for free download. It's called Human Rights Tools for a Changing World, a step-by-step guide to human rights fact-finding, documentation, and advocacy. It's available at the link below, and Chapter 9 focuses on advocacy at the United Nations. So you can read in more detail the things that I've covered during our talk. So I hope you found this overview of United Nations human rights mechanisms interesting and of use. Tune back in for more training videos on other topics soon. Thank you.